Thank you, Dan. Delighted to be here. And before I begin, I want to acknowledge a few people that have helped me shape my thinking on sludge. I'll start with Richard Thaler, who coined the term, Cass Sunstein, who's written a heck of a lot on this topic, and then Kate, Daniel, Melanie Kim, Bing Feng, and Niketna, who have written with me on this topic. And a huge shout out to Rory and the gang at Ogilvy. I mean, this has been absolutely stunning to get the audience that you have here. The world is flat. We get to avoid London Heathrow. Life is good. So let me jump right in. I'm going to start with the story that happened to me about a year ago. I'll then go back in time 26 years to give you another example, come back 6 years ago, and we'll talk about the future. So about a year ago, I fell into what is now well known as a subscription trap. So I had signed up for a book that I purchased and accidentally had ended up purchasing a subscription to a newspaper that I didn't really want to read. Now, this has probably happened to most of you. And it happens because had I been paying attention to the book purchase and the papers I signed, I probably would have not fallen into this trap. But we're all human. We have limited attention. We are emotional. We are distracted. And sellers often make it easy for people to buy things. Now, that in itself isn't bad. But in my case, it went one step further, which is they accidentally slipped in items into my shopping bag when I wasn't actually intending to purchase them. And it's not a nice thing to do, but it does happen a heck of a lot. The interesting part of my story relates to what happened afterwards, when I obviously decided that I wanted to now cancel this subscription. Sounds like an easy thing to do, but it actually involved several website visits, unanswered email, phone calls where I repeatedly got tossed from agent to agent. And all of this took a few weeks, and at the end of which most humans would have given up. But like the good academic, I pressed on and on and on. And I eventually learned that in order to cancel my subscription, I needed to, hold your breath, mail in a letter, like one of these things with a stamp and everything. So I needed to do that. They needed a wet signature on it. I couldn't just print out a signature and making a request. After a 6-week processing period, they would then send me a form, which I needed to fill in, and then again, hold your breath, fax in. And at the end of that process, they would apparently deduct some unknown amount for a processing fee and an unknown amount for newspapers already received. And I looked back at the website. It said that you can cancel anytime. And in theory, I guess I could cancel anytime. In practice, there were just so many hurdles in the way that the best intention to cancel might never really translate into actual cancellation. And that's a classic example of what I'm going to call sludge. Now, this also reminds me of a mail-in rebate promotion that I came across back in 1994. I was a graduate student at the University of Chicago working on my PhD. Back in the days of newspapers, I would actually read newspapers because I had some really interesting examples to draw from. And this was one that I'm thankful I saved because I guess I had the foresight that I'd be speaking about it 26 years later. This is an appliance store, so they're selling stuff that is pretty expensive. It's not cheap, and they promise to give you 50% cash back. And that piqued my interest. I said, let me find out what this actually entails. It says, buy it, use it, and then receive 50% of your cash back in 10 years. And then it goes on to explain what you need to do. So it says, at the end of 10 years, you will receive a refund of 50% of your purchase price. There is no catch. Simply send in the official registration form that you would receive at the time of sale, a legible copy of your original receipt, and a proof of identification within 30 days. Now, once you've done that, they will then mail you something called a refund claim form, which you need to save. It's on paper and nothing else. You save that for 9 years. And at the end of the 9 years, within 45 days of the 9th anniversary of the purchase of your appliance, they will then mail you the refund, even if you do not own the appliance. And I'm sure many of you will also not hesitate to call this sludge. right? So what is the sludge thing that I speak of? Sludge can be defined as frictions in a process that impede end users. They confuse people. They ultimately prevent people from doing things that they believe that they're going to be able to do. And it eventually reduces the consumer's welfare. And if you've been hit by sludge, which I suspect all of you have been, put your favorite example either on the chat box here or on Twitter. I'd love to see what sort of sludge you've been hit by. Right? Now, while my two stories illustrate the basic ideas of what sludge is, and for me, they were a minor inconvenience, it actually helped me tell a story today. For a lot of other people, the consequences of sludge can be devastating. So in particular, I'm going to think about two areas: welfare payments, when we often have governments have programs to help low-income consumers, or healthcare services, where the consequences of sludge are much higher. So when you think about welfare or healthcare, the idea is to reach as many of the intended recipients as possible. Right? And I'm going to illustrate that with a very simple metaphor. So this is going to be sort of the so-called reach challenge. So imagine that you run the water system for a metaphorical city, and your job is to get water from the storage tower or the treatment plant into as many houses in the city as you possibly can. And what is going to flow from that main pipeline is going to go through that grid of pipelines, and it's going to eventually enter every single house. Some houses might actually get no water because they might be off the grid. So here we've got this new construction on the bottom left, it's off the grid. But the solution is simple. I mean, all you're going to do here is to add another pipe and extend the pipeline, and you can eventually reach that extra house. But I also worry about other houses that are on the grid, but that still do not get water. Why does that happen? Because perhaps the plumbing is old and corroded, and maybe it looks like this. Pipes are full of sludge. Think of sludge as any obstruction to the water flow in a pipeline, anything that prevents water from getting from one end of the pipeline to the other end. This is a new form of the reach problem. It's a much more insidious version, where we have an illusion that we are reaching everyone. We have an illusion that we are supplying water all across the city, but nothing actually makes it through the choked and leaky pipelines. And this is a big problem. So over a century ago, American psychologist and philosopher William James always said that human behavior is a function of the organism and the environment. In behavioral econ terms, we call that context. And he was very dramatic when he wrote. He talked about sort of people making decisions, people trying to overcome hurdles and take action as a walk in a garden or a field that has psychological fences and psychological gates. The presence of gates makes things easy for people. Now, obviously, everybody who's here has heard the term nudge that Richard and Cass coined in 2008. If you haven't heard the term nudge, why are you at Nudgestock? But the concept of a gate really is similar to a nudge. And the reason for that is it facilitates decision making, it facilitates action because people follow the path of least resistance. So Richard always says, make things easy and people will do it. In Lewis systems, open the gates and people will do it. So changing defaults or simplifying information or presenting options differently can influence the final choice that people make simply by steering people towards and facilitating those choices. Now, you could think about sludge as the evil cousin of nudge, right? Sludge impedes our ability to get things done by erecting psychological fences. Mind you, these are psychological fences, not real fences, right? Now, also mind you that not all fences are bad. You often want fences for certain reasons. Sometimes we deliberately want to slow people down from making rash decisions. So think about decision making in the domain of divorce, right? You don't want divorce, both in marriages or in business partnerships or in other forms of relationships, to be too easy. You want some sludge there. If divorce was as easy as Amazon's one-click shopping button, then I suspect our world would look dramatically different today. But think about contract negotiation processes, right? We often impose cooling off periods so that both parties can proverbially sleep on their decisions, think about their promises, and make sure that they didn't actually do anything that they would later regret in the heat of the moment. And those of you who are on Twitter will have probably read yesterday, a lot of people in this group sharing a news article about Twitter introducing an initiative asking people to confirm that they have read a news article that they're about to share. And that's an example to me of a good friction. It slows things down a little bit. You got to actually open the damn thing and read it before you share it. But it's a good friction to combat fake news. So again, sludge isn't always bad, or friction isn't always bad, right? I'm going to present this matrix, which captures the basic essence of my argument. I've got 4 zones here. This is also similar to some of the ideas that Cass Sunstein writes about in some of his work. In zone 1, that's your Thaler and Sunstein zone. We nudge to help people. We nudge to make things easy for end users. We nudge for good. But as we can see in zone 2, not all instances of making it easy are good. Not all of them help consumers. So my newspaper subscription example is one of those. These things are also called dark patterns in the web design world, patterns that somehow induce people into making purchases or taking actions that they later would regret. Also in zone 3, we spoke about that. Some friction can actually be good. It can make people vigilant. It can prompt thoughtfulness. Sludge falls in zone 4. It creates impedance and it reduces welfare. Now, getting welfare and healthcare to people that need it the most can definitely benefit from Amazon's one-click shopping button. We don't do that. We require the poorest people to fill complex forms to access welfare. These are precisely the kind of people who don't have the time or the energy or the bandwidth to fill these complex forms. In Canada, for example, and even in the UK, we say that we have a healthcare system that is free and inclusive, but we require our patients to take time out from a workday or to travel long distances to get the closest appointment, the next possible appointment. And again, the poorest are the ones that are least likely to have the bandwidth to afford the time or the money to get the free care that we promise them and that they so desperately need. Here's another example. The Canada Learning Bond offered low-income Canadians a free $2,000 to educate their children. Yet, only 16%, 1/6 of eligible low-income Canadians claim that money in the first year or so after the program was launched. Maybe there was an awareness problem, but it turns out that awareness was only a small part of the problem. As you can see in these promotional materials, the words free money was splattered all over the posters and the brochures, but it wasn't really free. So to get the money, recipients needed something called an RESP account. This is a specific type of a registered investment account. To get that, they needed to go to a government service center. They also needed a birth certificate for their child, which was another process in of itself. And then they required lots of time and lots of patience. And again, this was a resource that was scarcest for the people who needed the money the most. Other potential recipients were recent immigrants, and they didn't understand either of the 2 Canadian national languages, English or French. Yet others came from proud cultures. They had just moved to Canada. They came from proud cultures that felt embarrassed opening a welfare account at a fancy bank where people dressed in suits and ties would potentially look down and take pity on them. And they just didn't want to do that. And so even though all of these potential recipients had technically been reached, Sludge had created an absolutely new form of impedance. Now, I often hear people say that a welfare program that has a low take-up rate was probably not needed, because after all, if I put money out for people and they didn't take it, maybe I shouldn't have done it in the first place. This is a real preference. Another important byline, therefore, from this example is the take-up of any welfare program is not a good indicator of its need. And that's because take-up is always mediated by sludge that we as policymakers can sometimes not even anticipate. As one of my collaborators, Jennifer Robson, says, implementation matters at least as much as clever ideas and interesting programs. There are three sources of sludge. There are clunky processes, so the one that I described for the Canada Learning Bond, poor communication, and I don't even want to start there, and processes that create negative emotions like embarrassment and shame. And just because you, as a program designer, don't feel embarrassed doesn't mean that others do. Empathy is a scarce resource, unfortunately, and we need to do much more to actually help people empathize. The Canada Learning Bond is just one example. There are many others to be found all around us. You just need to look. So for example, an innovative operations researcher at a fast food restaurant created this ingenious algorithm that could assign frontline workers, the cashiers, the people that flip burgers, to shifts the night before. In other words, just in time. And the idea was that this saved a lot of money for the restaurant chain. But of course, this also created sludge for single parents who could not find or could not afford childcare at the last minute, and they just got excluded from this job. Another example is a housing subsidy program that I came across in Latin America. They found that potential aid recipients lied on the form to claim welfare, and they actually lied and said that their homes were in better shape than they actually were. Why did they do that? They forego subsidy dollars, but they did that because the design of the form was such that if you checked no to many of the reasons, it was easy for anyone looking at the form to see that you lived in a poor quality house. And they didn't want the inspector who was going to come and collect the form to know that. Embarrassment, right? Several years ago, there was a merger of two bureaus within the government here, and I've seen this happen in a number of federal and provincial and municipal governments all across the world. But I ran into a situation where I needed to get a form that I needed to fill up and submit to get the form that I needed to report my employment status on. So I needed a form to get a form. And I could go on, but I trust that you get the point. And to Rory, I would say that if he ever did a sludge stock instead of a Nudgestock, my suspicion is it would last a lot more than 12 hours. We could go on and on and on. Right? So let me sort of wrap up by saying the following. Sludge is insidious because it is difficult to see. Right? And mind you, not all sludge is deliberate. So I want to emphasize, not every single instance is deliberate. It's a bit like weeds in your garden. Right? You don't actually plant them there, but if you don't look, they take over your backyard and they take over your garden. It just builds up in our process pipelines. And unless we monitor and maintain them, it's going to take over and choke your pipes. One person's sludge might not even seem like a significant inconvenience to another one. As practitioners, it is difficult for us to empathize with the context as well as the cognitive and emotional baggage that our end users bring to any interaction with us. Therefore, we must employ systematic approaches and scorecards to continuously detect and measure sludge. And those of you who are interested, there's a recent BEAR report on our web pages that provides some examples on how this can be done. So sludge is a psychological problem, not a logistical one. Without a deliberate attempt to identify, clean, and prevent sludge in our systems, I just worry that we might create an illusion of reach without actually reaching everyone that we think we are reaching. So I'll pause there and turn it back to Rory for comments and questions.
So fantastic question. Thank you very much for that, Dilip. I mean, I think it's really important to make that point that not all sludge is intentional. It's also, I think, important to make the point that there's some forms of sludge which are a kind of tragedy of the commons, so that having had the same experience as you when subscribing to online publications, I'm now disproportionately reluctant to subscribe to anything. Because if I knew and were promised up front that there was a really easy cancellation mechanism, okay, I would actually subscribe on spec to quite a few more things. But now I'm terrified that essentially 7 years from now, I'll realize I've been paying £7 a month for some obscure publication. And so that's an interesting case where short-term optimization in marketing is at loggerheads with long-term desirable behavior, I think. And that's, I think, evidence of someone somewhere is optimizing the wrong thing. There's a fantastic question from Keith Hutchings wondering what types of sludge are preventing people from taking action on climate change. Unnoticed choke points. And someone was in contact with me recently talking about if you actually look in any depth into the business of solar panels, essentially, unless you're a qualified electrical engineer, you will be completely baffled within about the first 20 minutes. So that's almost a case of linguistic sludge. I'd love to know your comments on that, because last mile sludge, I think, is majorly a problem with environmental behavior.
I think it is. And I think that's why we sort of think about these three sources of sludge. It's not just about having a simple process, right? But you've got to communicate in the language that the person understands. This, Rory, is marketing 101. But it's amazing how often people don't think about that. And I think the reason they don't think about that is some of the ways in which we've gone about collecting market research data to figure out what we think the end user needs to know is very different from what they actually need to know. So you're spot on in terms of the linguistic sludge for solar panels. I tried to install one, and God, I have a PhD and I couldn't understand that, right? Or opening retirement accounts, or even thinking about some of these RESP things. It's we just believe that people need more information and more technical details and more specifications. And in fact, we end up with quite the opposite result. So I think with environment, we have a lot of issues. There's obviously last mile sludge. There are bigger challenges, which is oftentimes when we look at conserving things like electricity, for example, right? We don't see the damn thing. And so if you can actually visualize electricity in some way, then I suspect we will reduce some of the sludge. So just even increasing the motivation, because at the end of the day, even if you have sludge, if people are motivated enough, and as an engineer, my metaphor is you can have a choked pipeline. If you create enough pressure, the water is going to flow through, right? But we think about them as separate things. And I think to your earlier point, organizations have optimized silos. They haven't optimized the end process. Organizations will think about what they can do and how can I optimize what I do, not what I want the customer to do, not what I want the end user to do. And I think that simple mindset change might solve a lot of problems. And so I'd say the biggest enemy is us. It's not the people. It's not the end users who aren't complying. I just don't think we as society have done a good enough job.
I mean, there's a question here, which is marketing and advertising a form of sludge? And I will open that up to you. I would argue that it's often the marketer within the organization who is the only person looking at the problem from the customer's point of view rather than from the institutional point of view. So we're often decisive in being the only people who can spot sludge in the first place. So what would your answer be to that, though? I mean, obviously, my answer does have quite a bit of confirmation bias attached to it.
So I'm with you. I think in theory, that's the way it should be. I suspect we might have sort of people that fall in the cusp in the sense that they believe that the rest of their organization can deliver stuff that they promise, but in fact, they can't. And so as marketers, we work on briefs that are given to us by the rest of the company. And so if we have a policy which says that we replace your appliance within a day, we promise that in our communication. But oftentimes, we need to kind of go dig a little bit deeper and say, what does that actually mean? So the newspaper promised me that I could cancel anytime, but they didn't tell me what cancellation actually entailed. And so I think that's the gap we need to bridge.
That is fantastic. Because one final thing, I've got to wrap now because I'm getting frantic messages on screen. One thing all marketers make the mistake of doing is we spend far too much time looking at emphasizing positives and far too little time looking for negatives that we could remove. And that's a kind of instinctive thing. And if we can start by saying, let's remove bottlenecks and sludge before we start adding positives, we'll have improved marketing in a stroke. Dilip, I've got to hand over to Dan. It's always a joy. How someone as nice as you got through the University of Chicago will always remain a mystery to me. But now it's time for me to pass over to Dan for some housekeeping issues.
I've fixed that by going to the University of Toronto right now. And so as a good Canadian, it balances out.
Well,
thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.